Welcome to the My Rules Are Better podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet, and today I have the pleasure of chatting once again with Barney Dicker. Hello, Barney.
Hello, Tom. Nice to be back on again.
So, you emailed me a number of really quite provocative and interesting topics, but I wanted to start with, you have been back to your games club, but also in your area there appears to also be a wargaming club as well. Can you describe a little bit about this promised land in which you live?
Sure. Okay. So we live about a minute's walk away from a Roman barracks, the remains of a Roman barracks, still not active anymore. And my daughter goes to school on the edge of that site, and it's a simple but kind of it's a simply maintained Roman ruin, and there are two kind of museum points that you can go and look around, and then some other open air bits and bobs. So I can walk up there, walk through the Roman remains, down the hill, and then I get to a nice little cafe cake place where every Monday there's a board game club, and it's free as far as the club is concerned. You usually buy a drink or two and eat something, and there can be 20 people there, maybe more. Sometimes it's 7 or something like that. But there's always one or two people who turn up with a couple of crates of different games. And that's really nice. Unfortunately, it's on a Monday, which is really bad for me as a parent and all of that. So whenever I get the chance and I can keep my eyes open long enough, I go down and play. And so, like I said in my email, I think I've been about 3 or 4 times. And so they tend to be more board game orientated. The game shop in town has what are they called? They're called lock-up rooms. No, what are they? Escape rooms. Escape rooms. They've got a shop, a really well-stocked shop, which has kind of got role-play games on the right-hand side and board games on the left, with some miniatures painted or otherwise, or just in blister packs here and there. But in the building next to it, they've got their escape room upstairs, and they also have then on the same ground floor, the street level, they also have a gaming room. And I've not really managed to infiltrate that group yet, because it's always a question then of time as well.
Certainly.
And so but I know that maybe they have a magic evening once a week. They have a kind of hobby painting evening once a week. At the weekends, it kind of revolves. So maybe it's wargaming once a month, board gaming once a month, role play games, and then maybe Pokemon or something like that. And there was the city had a city festival, and on Saturday night there was a stage set up in the nearby square, and then it was also the board game evening. So they were kind of sitting outside and playing. And then the other night I was coming home from something in town, and some people had set up X-Wing and Infinity outside in the street. And I stopped for a quick little chat. And it was nice, they really nice big tables, happy as Larry, everyone out in the good weather. Yeah. So that's good. That's really good. And I'm really keen to get down there eventually. I think I need to kind of turn up and be a bit of a wallflower, or whatever you might call it.
Certainly.
And just see who's playing what.
The blueprint for a successful game store, when we still lived in the UK, my wife frequented a cloth craft store that was basically, I guess, a quilting store. And the owner became quite friendly and actually offered the store to my wife, I think for about £30,000, which we seriously considered at the time. And I've always regretted that I never, went in, because the model tends to be, with quilting stores at least, that the husband runs the books and the wife runs the store. But here's the critical thing. In order for these stores to be successful, and the same is exactly true with a game store, you need to allocate a certain amount of floor space for play. And you need to, teach classes perhaps, but also just allow a certain amount of the space for play. And the successful game stores will typically have a ratio of about 30% to 50% play area to sales space. And that is really important. Now, Games Workshop has tried to formalize this and play with the numbers and tried to reduce it and put more stock on the shelves and these kind of things. And I think with Games Workshop, you're dealing with, cocaine or heroin, right? People are coming in very specifically. But for more generalist game stores, the space to play is really critical. And I find this all over the world, Australia, the UK, all parts of the US, that when I find a successful game store, it will always have a play area and it will always have a roster of, as you say, evenings. And this translates internationally very well because it means that it's, as you find with your board game club, it's a friendly place to come and play games. And if you buy, a cake or a coffee or what have you, that's an additional thing. The same is true in a game store, except what you're buying there is miniatures, paints, rule books, this kind of stuff too. I think the notion of a social epicenter where things are done in a kind of creative, playful fashion is really important. Now, you think, with these stores, this is going to be mainly, children, what have you. No. Actually, the adults drive these stores far more than the children do through these kind of evening play sessions. Anyway, I find it fascinating.
I think in terms, if you compare the shop floor to the play rooms, not the escape room, I think it's more play area to shop area because, of course, you pack the games in, and obviously they've got to store them underneath. But I think what's interesting about that is that play area is not always open. So then the ratio, the time allotment is reduced, but the space is always there for when the time is needed. I think another really interesting thing that I've noticed about game shops is especially getting into board games, I suppose, as well. But it's also true of the miniatures that actually in the game shops the prices are pretty much the same as online. And you don't tend to get that in other industries. That, as far as I can really tell, if they've got it in stock, you probably can't get it much cheaper. There are I think sometimes exceptions to that, and obviously things aren't in stock. But I think whatever distribution model is going on there, it's that also seems to lean a little towards really wanting people to buy from the shops.
I think all the companies concerned, but Games Workshop specifically, made a decision in, when was it? Probably about 2003, 2004, to make sure that there were no more deep discounts online. There was a kind of golden period up until that point where you could get 40+% off online. And I think it really attacked the local game stores. It also attacked, the retail business of these companies as well. So I think the decision was made but that's the same with most hobbies. I mean, the same with my wife's clothcraft hobbies. They've all made this decision. I think, that time period was just because I remember that before then, when you could buy, 30, 40% off online quite comfortably. But obviously it's a losing proposition for all these things, and it doesn't get people into the hobbies as well. Like you still need a physical store for almost all this stuff to actually introduce people to these kind of things. So, but fascinating to read that there's so much kind of outcrop of playfulness in your area. So I was really pleased to read that.
It's good. And I live 1 minute from a game designer by chance. And if I walk the other way, a real enthusiast and they're both often down in the Monday Club. So that's nice to have them around and wave at them as they cycle by or something like that. You often mention Realm of Chaos in the podcast, and I don't know if you heard the sad news that co-author of Slaves to Darkness, Mike Brunton, died. And there's a really nice commemorative episode of the Grognard Files, which I think is a fantastic podcast, which has an interview with Mike Brunton. And it was meant to be part 2 of 2 episodes on White Dwarf. So there was already the part 1 as well, which contains some of the interview with him in there as well. So that's an occurrence. But that the Grognard Files episodes, all episodes, but perhaps this one especially is definitely worth a listen.
Good to know. Good to know. It's difficult to say. I mean, I'm meeting Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone in less than a month now, I think. And I'm trying to, I don't know, there's just so much stuff to talk about. It's really quite difficult. I'm trying to pick how I'll wander into various topics, what it'll be like. I'm never sure whether it'll be a quick lunch or a slow lunch or what the pace of the lunch will be. And obviously there's a certain degree of formality with regards to introductions and discussions before one gets into the kind of deep nerd topics. So
sure.
I will certainly listen to that. I think I'll probably even listen to it well before I leave. But yeah, the tapestry of folks that were involved with early Games Workshop, I have a small list of people to talk about, but I really, I probably should listen to that and take notes through it.
What's great about the Grognard Files is White Dwarf is kind of the central hub of the podcast, and they split off from that, of course, and they're looking back at late 70s and 80s role play games, of course, but the key thing, the centrality of White Dwarf is that for those years, White Dwarf was catering for all of those, a kind of pantheistic culture of role play gaming, and trying to unpick all of those, or shine a light on all of those those connections between the different systems, the different authors, the different projects, the editions, all of those kinds of things.
Yes,
it's good fun.
Beautifully incestuous.
It's very good fun.
Yes,
absolutely. And I was fascinated to hear in your last one that you're now obsessed with street urchins in Victorian Britain. And I sent you another email, didn't I, saying, I want to recommend Peter Ackroyd's Hawksmoor to you, which isn't actually a Victorian story, but you have this kind of you have this Elizabethan story and you have this 80s story, and they kind of dovetail together. And it's very weird and spooky. And but what I think is great about it is that you really have that sense of London in it. And of course, Peter Ackroyd has subsequently written a biography of London or something like that. So I thought you just get that sense of the deep history of the layers of this city. So and I got it as an audiobook read by Derek Jacobi, and I thought he did a fantastic job. And I think I've listened to it about 3 times. It's good fun, good listening. That.
So you point out Victorian London. I probably, you had a question associated with whether I've given up on game design. I'm going to put that one aside and just describe what has happened in the past couple of weeks, and then we can touch on that. When I describe the group that I have at work, I probably should preface this by saying I have no other gaming outlets other than this group at work. So it's really important for me that these people are doing something that they enjoy and want to participate in. And through the prompting primarily of Chris Abbott, I started to wonder, are the Chechen, is a Chechen-based game a bridge too far? So I thought, okay, well, what other options are available? Victorian London, zombie apocalypse. Went and found rules in this circumstance. And then, look, these are thinking people, They aren't just a faceless mass of players. So I went to each of them individually. And I set out to them, here are the potential rules, and I could physically pass them, certain aspects of the rules if they were interested. And none of them picked Chechnya 1992. The interesting thing
that's quite a clear message, isn't it? That's a clear message.
Yeah, you've got to learn from these things. Learning experience. What was fascinating was how divided they were about the other 2 subject matters. And what I found fascinating was that people that had done a little bit of travelling in Europe in general, but also maybe had touched on London, but really just Europe. I mean, the fellow who was most persuasive about Victorian London had just spent a month in Amsterdam, just wandering around, And I thought to myself, this is really fascinating. There are 2 kinds of psychologies that I'm seeing here. And we have decided by just a single vote that we will do zombie apocalypse. Now, what's fascinating through this is that there's very few miniatures that cater to zombie apocalypse, like contemporary miniatures. So I'm now looking at what exists in plastic and all these other things to do that. Now, you made a more important point, and I want to make this clear. This podcast is a separate venture to the game that I play at work. So although we're going to be doing an existing rule set with work, I found a little bag of miniatures, which I purchased at a place called, Neptune's Comics and Games. As you're a fan of Gorka Morka, there are, and I haven't counted them yet, I need to go through and do that, there are probably about 24 Gorka Morka orcs and about 15 Ketchikan Imperial Guard, with one very special character through that. And I whipped 3 coats of 3 colours of paint on them, dipped them, and put them in this bag with the view that I wanted to write a rule system about them. This is completely outside the space that we've talked about, historical and stuff like that. But I'm interested in a fun skirmish game, maybe even on Hex, to mix all possible metaphors here. Because the Ketchikans, 2 of them are carrying explosives, like large explosive charge kind of pack things. And writing that into a rule system, the old thing was, well, you put a counter down. Well, no one's ever going to walk on the counter, so they're never going to explode. What interests me is line charges, i.e. that if you cross a line, then the charge goes off in certain circumstances. So a few possibilities there. What I'm saying is, irrespective of what I play at work, I'm still going to be writing rule systems and meddling with dice rolls and card mechanics and other things in this podcast. So as a listener first and a participant second, your concern was very real, and I wanted to note that here. But it doesn't mean that... continue. Go on. Well, it doesn't mean that I'm giving up on the whole topic of this podcast just to lament about, Warhammer 40k tournament players. So I just want to make that clear, that these two things are separate. And look, I'm going to talk about the game of work without question. Yeah. But, these two are separate things. Did that answer your concern?
It does. I mean, I was just, struck by listening to the last, 1.5 episodes, or, the last 2. And so having had all of this, all of the build-up that you give it and the progression, you kind of, at one point you just say, so I won't run it, and maybe I'll just do Dungeons and Dragons. So, and I kind of
deflated, I think, is the
chuckled in a sad way, a little bit, because it just seemed like, I think he might have given up. But I also couldn't believe that would be the case. I couldn't believe it. So it was all very tongue in cheek when I spoke of DIY game designer Tom Barbalet's Dark Knight of the Soul. That was all. I knew you wouldn't have given up on it, so I wasn't too worried.
Another point that I wanted to make, which Chris Abbott made when I talked to him, because Chris and I have known each other for now a decade, is I spend a good portion of my evenings in simulation space, working currently on my Noble Ape simulation. I'm writing it as an iOS app for the iPhone. And that takes some of my probability gaming simulation thing in my mind. So it's not that there's a deficiency currently in this area, it's that I'm compensating an area that I can't talk about in this podcast because it's not really the topic of the podcast. So I do fulfill certain aspects of this thing through working on my simulation project as well. And that's another point that I wanted to make. So if you see it lacking, it's because a large portion of my cognitive time after hours is spent working on this thing, which is taking up some of that aspect. But I do appreciate that I have a podcast to record here, and I do appreciate that the topic of this podcast relates specifically to creating eclectic and interesting rule systems. So yes, I'm not going to put this thing down.
Good. No, I wasn't really worried about that. I just thought, but the gaming group aren't going to be guinea pigs anymore.
Not for now. Not for now. I'm softening them up. We did talk about playing the Victorian rules after the zombie rules, and I might throw in a couple of Knights of Chechnya as well. You never know, but for now, it's zombies uber alles.
And there was the other thing, wasn't there? There's this other point that you make, that as you read the zombie apocalypse, that you were struck by how similar the rules were to yours. And so I kind of thought, that's an interesting, challenging thing where when you encounter that kind of thing, you have that moment of thinking, well, should I persevere with my thing or in the way I've been doing it? And and 9 times out of 10, I always think it makes you think a little bit more out of the box, a bit even further out of the box.
I think it's important to show my co-workers, I mean, I have a responsibility here to show them a certain degree of diversity. And what's fascinating is reading the Victorian London rules as well. They add elements, although it was more a kind of squad, although this isn't the right term for Victorian London, but, 5 miniatures per person kind of interaction. But very similar again, I think, and this was part of one of your other questions, this tension between wargaming and role-playing games seems to fit very comfortably currently in kind of skirmish games with miniatures with slightly more stats and character than they would have in a war game. And this seems to be represented with a variety of different genres and settings in a number of different games currently. Let's talk a little bit about your question associated with war game, role-playing game tension. Can you break into this?
So we talked about that. We talked about this last time a little bit, and when I listened back again to some of the earlier episodes,
yes,
the earlier episodes of of my rules, you talk about hit locations and how that's there's a differentiation there between role-play games and skirmish games, and hit points, and so I thought that's really interesting, and I was trying to articulate last time this idea of the kind of the pseudo agency of these little miniature characters as they go about their business, which seems very much reduced in the war game, simplified, and in the role-play game it's kind of
expanded,
at least trying to kind of map your own being. And actually listening to the Mike Brunton interview, he talks about skill progressions being a thing in role-play games more than in war games, where the stats tend to be quite fixed. And so I thought that's quite an interesting idea. Have that clearer sense of progression. Now, of course, when you have a campaign, a skirmish campaign and a gang, then there's inserted in between each game, there's usually, the downtime period where you might spend points or money or whatever getting more skills and equipment. So it's not entirely the case, but then there are always those counter restrictions, aren't there, where, I don't know, maybe there's a limit to how many champions you can have or how many one-off characters you can have or how much you can spend on something. And whereas in a role-play game, that seems to be more unrestricted and part of that process of playing.
Have you played Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay ever?
I have, yes.
That has just such a beautiful and elaborate skill progression. I mean, that is a game which strikes me where the skill progression is so much part of the game in terms of character development, in terms of like a rich kind of fractal-like tapestry of skill progression. And it's interesting I'm warming myself up, I guess, to listen to the podcast that you've listened to. But if Games Workshop did anything for role-playing games, it was to create a game which was so heavily based on skill progression above almost everything else in the game.
Yeah, I guess I didn't, when I picked it up as a teenager, I had less kind of frame of reference, I suppose. It just appealed.
Well, that's what, I mean, having been a long time D&D player, when I picked it up, probably aged 13, 14, firstly, the quality of the book and the characterfulness of the ideas and the rules really struck me, but it was so different from D&D, and the intentional part that I saw immediately was this notion of really elaborate skill progression, which almost was like a choose your own adventure book in itself, because you're moving between skills and like, what will this character evolve into with these kind of join the dots skill progression, which seems so central in the game. So yes, anyway, sorry, I completely derailed your train of thought.
No. So I guess, in this kind of ongoing discussion of that productive, difficult tension between the war games and the role-play games, I was thinking, I wonder if there's a kind of a checklist, perhaps a working list these different aspects that one has to think about, particularly in deciding how to try and occupy that mid ground between the two, or to be conscious of the fact that if you pick one approach over another, that you are in that element skewing it more to the one than the other.
I think there's a practical nature to this thing, right? I mean, my perspective is when I came to just playing Chaos, I had existing role-playing rule set, which I then cut to pieces, and I wanted to describe skirmish-level battles, which had a certain set of requirements. And I kind of traded it off, rolled a bunch of dice, played a bunch of games with myself, and then put it out to a broader audience. And my perspective is maybe if games are designed by committees or in groups, they would have more of the quality that you describe. But from my perspective, there was just a distinct practicality to the thing, which was take what was basically a very rough role-playing game. I mean, rough in terms of not a lot of details in between certain bits, and then put a bunch of miniatures on the table, and then get this thing so it's workable with the miniatures. What's interesting is how, looking at these different rule sets for, skirmish-level games, you can see some degree of just, applied pragmatism that has to go on in these things. You don't want something that's too cognitive, you want something that is people can return to and have fun with. And I think what's interesting with playing D&D at work versus playing Chaos is with D&D, there was a group which was larger, without question, but very different in play and returningness, if that's such a thing. People that came back. And when we got to the skirmish level game at work, that was the perfect mix of, I don't want to be burdened of thinking about a character prior. I want to come for an evening, eat a bit of pizza, roll some dice, work my way through a series of problems, and then, pause it for another month or so, or another 2 weeks, and then come back and do the same thing again. And I think what's interesting is that these are distinctly different player groups. And what is happening now, and Games Workshop has come to the party very late, but there's been some, understanding through the market and through various people playing that if you want a particular audience that will come back and remain loyal to these games but not be completely obsessive about these games, then this is the perfect space to do it in. And what rules are there? What rules kind of flutter backwards and forwards if there's a straight line between role-playing games and war games? There's going to be some collection of these things which meet in the skirmish game. It's not always going to be heavily weighted in either direction. Sometimes there are going to be missing rules, which is what interested me reading through the Victorian London rules was that there were clearly rules that were missing. Like there were clearly arbitrations and points of interaction that would require house rules, which I thought was wonderful from my perspective and critical. This is the distinction perhaps also, and there are so many games in the space as well, many down to the, minutiae of rules, the thick rule books, which you really don't need for a skirmish game. The thicker the rule book, the more obscene it is really with a skirmish game. But, you've got thick rule book skirmish games where absolutely everything is specified and everything's written out in extensive, what have you. And then you've got the thin rule book skirmish games, the Victorian London rules that I have, which I should have close so I can actually quote them. Maybe 48 pages at most of small book, not large book.
Okay.
So I think the length of rules is another important point, which we've not really discussed for these kind of games. You don't want D&D sized rule books. You want something that's thin, easy to flip through, point to, and play.
Yeah. When I first spoke to you on the podcast, I talked a bit about the Strontium Dog miniatures game, and I kind of didn't talk too much about it. I talked more about Inquisitor, but there's exactly those same gaps in the Strontium Dog rules, which allow for some kind of house rule interpretation, which I think is fascinating. Even I don't know if this is the same with these Victorian rules that you have. Skills, for example, you could say that they're quite woolly, but what they basically have are skills for the characters that they've included in the game. But they keep saying, well, you can have your own ones, or you can do it your own way. That's really interesting because, of course, it requires you to have some kind of a conversation with your co-player about what seems fair or balanced or good fun. Even we've talked about that. Maybe it's better to have fun than to get balanced. What makes a fun session. So that's really, I find that very inspiring, and that would even come back to this issue of empowerment that you're almost saying. I think that if you have a good slim rule set, it allows for that empowerment to seep back in when you start to engage with it and play it,
yes.
Compared to something which is going to just make you feel like you're failing the whole time and just getting things wrong and wrong and wrong when it's so detailed and concrete in every aspect.
One of the things that I liked about the set of miniatures that I picked up from Neptune Comics and Games was that the orcs are relatively uniform. They have, sluggers and hand weapons. The humans are the tricksy things. They're the ones with explosives and, a couple of different kinds of weapons. And what interests me is that in and of itself kind of distills the two races, right? And I think within that, in terms of, on one side, some degree of rules, on the other side, just wave of green. There are ways in which you can explore these things. And what I think the Victorian rule system, to be frank, originally I was going to play werewolf, vampire-esque. My players said to me, quite strongly, that if it didn't have vampires in it, they weren't going to play. So that made it very clear. But
okay.
I think what I find fascinating with the zombies, for example, is that there is the us versus them. You're not dealing with us. Us and them are very different in these games. And I think that's particularly interesting. And just like Chaos, less so, right? Basically similar kinds of humans, some kind of very minor stat modifications, but basically playing against something that is similar enough to you to be, comparable. And I think that's another dynamic in the skirmish game, which I find fascinating. When you have skirmish games with even opposition that is the same as you, basically, in terms of stats, versus the zombie apocalypse, where the opponents are very different and actually faceless in this case. So the nature of a game that requires players to come together, whether the same kind of players or players to come together and a GM within a skirmish game, creates an interesting dynamic that I wanted to just leave you with as a topic to talk about when we next speak. Just to think about in broader kind of space. One thing I wanted
the GM, the role of the GM, right? That's good,
actually, the player experience when they are not actually in direct conflict with another player. So there are these games where players are in direct conflict. And actually, quite beautifully, as I have been narrating in this podcast associated with the archetypal Warhammer 40,000 tournament player, I am subscribed to Frontline Gaming on YouTube. They also paint a portion of my miniatures, in some cases rather slowly, but still they paint them. And what is fascinating is they now do tournaments on YouTube. Now, we have an Apple TV downstairs. My wife was doing something. We were about to watch the Tolkien movie, which is another topic that I wanted to raise. I just put it on and was just watching these two gentlemen in Temecula in Southern California, which is near where my in-laws live. They were playing a civilized game of Warhammer 40,000, which was really wonderful to watch. It was wonderful to watch because there were nuances. There was a lot of discussion. There was discussion particularly when someone accidentally moved or rolled incorrectly or, started moving infantry and then wanted to move a tank and had a wonderful discussion with the player, with his opponent associated with, would that be okay? I mean, this was a civilized game of Warhammer 40,000, which was actually a real pleasure to watch. So I want to say that the opponent versus opponent, same kind of stuff, point matched, evened out games can still be something that convey nuances that I wanted to represent positively in this podcast. So it's fascinating actually to see that, because certainly my experience, the best games of Warhammer 40,000 I've played have been like that. And whenever I've seen any twinges of aggressive tournament play, I've kind of stepped away from the game and, spent in some case many years not playing the game going forward. But it is interesting, the dynamic between opposing players versus a group of players that are collectively, bound on fighting an opposing foe.
Yeah.
Different things psychologically.
I think there is something interesting about having a team where each player has one character that they're looking after, and they're up against the game, or the the game master, or the system itself. There is something there. I think there's more to be done with that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
I have been rewatching the Lord of the Rings trilogy with my wife through random things that just happened. And we found last night by chance a film loosely based, let me say, on the life of Tolkien, which I found fascinating on a number of levels. Now, my favourite book relating to Tolkien was a Ballantine Press. I don't know, it was kind of a deep nerd biography of the man.
Okay.
Ballantine Press, if you're not familiar, I've got a pile of them here, but through the 1960s and 1970s, they were what Osprey is now, except they actually produced, I don't know, maybe 150, 200 page at most, potted histories of various things in the primarily Second World War, but also some stuff in the First World War. I absolutely love them. I discovered them actually, I think 7 years ago this week, maybe 8 years ago this week, in a bookstore. I have this because Facebook gives you updates, and I'm like, 7 years ago, or maybe 8 years ago, I was in East Lansing, Michigan, and I stumbled across, you occasionally wander into these bookstores if you're a bibliophile, and you realize this is my spirit bookstore, so to speak. And this was one of those experiences. They had a pile of really old model railroaders in the basement, as everything in Michigan does. And they had these Ballantine books, which I'm wondering if I had been exposed to them previously. Anyway, they're books that you can hold in your hand, associated with a wide variety of very potted histories associated with it. But they also wrote a book on Tolkien, amongst other things. They also had they're a curious series of books that they also published as well, not for this podcast, but they wrote a book on Tolkien. And it is a, for nerds' eyes, deep dive into various vignettes of Tolkien's life, which strangely enough have you seen the Tolkien film?
No.
Okay.
No.
I'm in two minds of recommending it or not recommending it. It has some it's very curious. The way in which the First World War is portrayed now is very similar to a lot of the concerns I have about the way the Second World War is portrayed now. I think increasingly people I know people, physical people that I've interacted with, who I would rate on some level as thinking human beings that don't know the difference between the First and Second World War. And I think increasingly this is in the US, let me say specifically in the US, obviously it wouldn't happen elsewhere. This, I think, is increasingly a phenomenon that people just don't understand the basic distinctions between these two conflicts, which are so different and so important, I think, to understand. Mm-hmm. So when you see the First World War portrayed in the way it was portrayed in the Tolkien film, it is very much led towards this. I mean, look, they're wearing the right kinds of helmets. They're in trenches. There was one rat that made an appearance. But, it was very curious. It was very abstract in that light. And I think without that aspect, and also they don't focus on the Birmingham period of his life either. It was, it was a ramshackle film made for a popular audience, as my wife pointed out. But it did remind me that Tolkien is really critical in terms of understanding where we are now. And although I would argue that the early war games, particularly the German war games, are as important and as poorly understood, or even more poorly understood generally, I still think it's really fascinating to realize that he was a conduit of so much history, and then he kind of spread it out into popular thought for at least a small period of time. What are your thoughts on the man?
I read Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast books before I read Tolkien, and I think that for me that shaped my idea of what fantasy should be and do. And so I've never been terribly impressed with, I suppose, what would you call it, high fantasy. Having said that, the Ralph Bakshi film of Lord of the Rings, I I think is fantastic. There's some fantastic sequences in that. And and this goes back to my whole thing of the anti-narrative attraction, theory of attraction type of thing, where I love the rotoscoping. I love the fact that you can see these grainy actors that have been they almost look like they've been, obviously it's ink, but they kind of look, it's got that watercolory feel, it's got that inky feel. And to see the characters kind of merge in and out or transform back and forth from being rotoscoped humans to being kind of full cartoon characters, I think is fantastic. And some of those backgrounds, the opening scene with the kind of cloth that appears to be over the image at the beginning, and that silhouette work, which is like Lottie Reiniger, that sequence where the ring wraiths come and hack the beds up. There's just kind of red backgrounds. So I think there's some fantastic visual stuff in that film, which for me, then when they did the more recent films, they, of course they looked like, was it the Alan Lee illustrations and all of that. But I think the only bit that interested me in the film was when Frodo's about to chuck the ring into the volcano. And there was just this, I don't know, just this great lighting on his face, the gold and everything. And that I just felt like, oh, that was a really good moment. But that was, 30 seconds in God knows
9 hours,
30 hours.
9 hours, yes.
But I'm well aware also that in a sense the films just went for the story of the narrative of Lord of the Rings, and they missed out on all of that wonderful kind of lore. That
well, the language isn't there, generates. Obviously. I mean, I think, to be perfectly clear, on a personal level, I read The Hobbit when I was probably about 9, because that's what you had to do, right? I was a nerd kid of a particular age, and I just picked up this copy and kind of read through it. And the Ring books themselves, I think I must have consumed passively, like literally, gotta finish this thing, when I was probably about 11 or 12. Like, I remember that they were really burdensome to me and just really dry. And obviously, it's difficult when you grow up in a colony versus growing up in England itself, I think. And I very much grew up in a colony. And, when I find people that don't like Tolkien but still are so heavily immersed in fantasy lore, these are my people. These are my kindred spirits, because I ultimately agree with these people as well. However, that being said, his importance is unquestionable. And what he did in terms of popular consciousness alone is unparalleled, I think, in our, broader areas of interest. But I think there are important things that need to be maintained associated with his story. Obviously, his early childhood, Birmingham in the later stages of the Industrial Revolution. Maybe, does one even say that? I don't know. Whatever the pre-First World War Industrial Revolution in Birmingham. And also his experiences in the First World War, which need to be kind of captured in kind of distilled chunks to understand. And I think with those things, you can understand a portion of his writing. The language and the lore, this is clearly a representation of his coping strategy based on hundreds, if not thousands of years worth of folklore, basically. And that is interesting as well. This notion of folklore as a coping strategy and a means of describing, which ultimately you get the kind of scholastic rewrites of the Bible through this as well. I mean, you get some amazing kind of tapestries of the human mind kind of captured with this one fellow. So I think he's an incredibly important person that is being perhaps misunderstood. Perhaps, I think the film at least ticked these boxes for me. And that is why I think in general it is probably a good thing rather than a neutral thing or a bad thing in kind of popular culture. But yeah, it was interesting to watch because I thought this is completely different line. I know you're a film person as well. The company I work for made a film about Eichmann's capture. Eichmann is an important person for me for a number of reasons. When I watched this film, I watched it with immense dread, because if they misdid Eichmann's capture, it was going to be something that would weigh on me sufficient that I would probably raise it within the company and cause trouble for myself. So thankfully, I thought, although there were some minuses, generally the pluses were there with regards to Eichmann's capture. I felt the same way with regards to this Tolkien film. Obviously, it would not be as destructive to my survival if they hadn't made it correctly, but it would be a really curious thing if they couldn't capture the elements. And in that regard, I think it was an interesting film. For you, I would say worth, if you get it on, streaming services or these kind of things, I think it's worth a watch.
I did see the Beatrix Potter film, I think, which to me seems like the obvious double DVD set to have Beatrix Potter, Miss Potter or whatever it's called, and Tolkien. Make a good pairing. And I do think, I think in some ways, I've kind of over cutesified Beatrix Potter, and actually some of those stories are really savage and hilarious. And what is it, The Two Bad Mice?
Yes.
I love the bit where they're trying to eat the doll's food. There's a lovely ham, a miniature ham, and it's ceramic. So they're getting really frustrated trying to cut the hams, and then smash it all up. I think there's some good rehabilitation that Beatrix Potter needs. Maybe they could do it together. Maybe they could, the sequel to both films could be them kind of meeting each other in another dimension or something.
Yeah.
On the with Madame Blavatsky or something like that.
When I was watching the Lord of the Rings films, the thing that struck me was that it was done by New Line Cinema. New Line Cinema has a wide variety of really curious films in their catalogue. One of the ones that I, periodically am compelled to see is the film Friday, which seems to me to be the antithesis of Lord of the Rings. But if you took those two films and put it together, in particular Gandalf as a kind of linking character, I think there's some elements there. One thing I wanted to conclude with, because it is such a controversial topic, but I thought we should at least conclude with this. Yeah. Narrative, as in the broader discussions, I've said the word, ladies and gentlemen, in My Rules Are Better. I wanted to leave you with this little vignette, and then let's explore narrative a little bit before we actually finally conclude.
Yeah.
Picture me, difficult to picture me currently, but picture me age 10, sitting in a hobbit hole, watching Matthew Gibson of this very podcast perform with his brother in front of me of the evils of Dungeons and Dragons versus the new powerful visionary thing, which is RuneQuest. Imagine this.
Okay.
This goes on for 3 hours. No bathroom breaks. Sitting cross-legged towards the end. This man, in his embodiment, had such an impact on me in early life that when he tells me that narrative is a bad word that should never be spoken ever again, thank you very much, even today, I will eliminate this word from my vocabulary for this particular recording. I think that distills perfectly the history of the term narrative in this podcast.
It's what's so hard is to find a word that positively defines this other thing than everything that we might call narrative. And that's where this attraction, the cinema of attraction idea in film or is some kind of thing, but it doesn't really do the job. So you're always talking about one is always talking of anti-narrative or that which isn't narrative or whatever. But listening back to those early episodes of My Rules Are Better, again, you say something like, narrative is of central importance to me developing these rules. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. He's gone from that kind of a position to us now having this debate.
There's something subtle here.
That's amazing.
There's something subtle here. Matthew's attack on the word narrative was associated with its meaninglessness and overuse, which I stand is probably both our points as well. And in doing that, what I'm talking about here is folklore, imagery,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
words. I mean, it's a bit like the word like. I'm not sure if you've ever experienced this, but, through school, I would have teachers that would say, never use the word like. There are so many descriptive words around, or the word love, or these kind of things with regards to food and these kind of things. There are too many words in the language that are better served than using this word like. And when you start exploring these other words, you start seeing a better, a more rich kind of tapestry of descriptive terms. So I think that is the challenge for what Matthew said. I was being lazy in my use of narrative. I should have talked about folklore. I should have talked about, strange histories. I should have talked about a variety of different pieces, and I used an easy word to not describe what I should be describing. That, I think, is the criticism.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the really interesting thing is this possibility that certain things that people often describe as being narrative elements or associated with narrative actually are better thought about, unshackled from that idea. So my kind of pitch to anyone who will listen to me bang on about this topic is basically that you get all of the benefits of narrative without needing to pin everything down to a narrative or a story or even a fiction or something like that. The movement between this imagined realm and the meta discourse, that doesn't need to be kind of mocked by a narrative threshold or something like that, because it's all part of the whole wonderful mix. So this idea of so when I heard you on the podcast making that kind of assertion and then following that development through, I just felt, yes, great. Here's somebody who's also then starting from that position, but trying then to kind of reinvent all of those features, think about them in a way that doesn't require that. So that was a nice listening moment for me too. But yes, folk art, I think that's fantastic. And someone like Levi-Strauss and this kind of structural analysis of myth and that kind of thing, I think that gets at something like that you have these elements of folk culture which kind of ping around the space and can be configured and reconfigured in different ways. And that's the kind of the ludic side to that the production of folk culture, I would say.
Barney, it has been a real pleasure as always. Please continue listening in, taking notes and returning periodically. Always a pleasure chatting with you.
See you, Tom.
Talk to you soon. Take care.